The first question I have for Amy and Henry, can you describe very briefly what are the major findings of your report?
Sure. I mean, I worked on the...
Maybe.
Sure. I worked on the July 5th section of the report, and the three major findings that that became apparent were that firstly, the Chinese government has not acknowledged that there was a peaceful demonstration on July 5th in Urumchi, and also that it had not acknowledged the underlying economic, social, and cultural grievances of the Uyghur people who assembled in People's Square on July 5th. The second finding from our interviewees was that we discovered Chinese security forces had used live deadly fire against Uyghur demonstrators. And the third finding in the July 5th section of the report was that the Chinese official media had underreported the beatings and killings of Uyghurs that occurred on July 6th and the 7th. So I worked on that section of the report, and I believe, Amy, you have some findings to share about September unrest and also the internet and so on.
Well, also in our section of the report on the unrest in September, we found through talking with witnesses that the Chinese government and state media really underreported the beatings of Uyghurs that took place, particularly in the first week of September. We had many personal accounts given to us in interviews of beatings and also killings of Uyghurs by civilians during that period. And I would also say, with regard to detentions, through the personal accounts that we obtained from speaking with residents of Urumchi, we really believe that the arbitrary nature of detentions in July and September has been severely underreported by Chinese authorities, and also the scope of detentions has been underreported.
My next question is, how do the events as documented in your report differ from the story covered either in the international press or the Chinese press? When I read the report, it focuses a fair amount on the Chinese press, but how was it different from the international press's coverage of events?
Maybe I'll just make one comment, which is I think that the international press really gravitates toward numbers, and we're dealing with an event that the Chinese government was obviously not transparent about. And so it's unfortunate that we were presented with a challenge in that we were not able to have easy access to numbers of people detained or people who may have been killed or injured. But when the Chinese government prepares numbers and gives them to the international press, they're very attractive.
I think one of the ways that it differs is that the international press characterizes the events on July 5th as the Uyghur riots. And whilst UHRP does not deny the fact that Uyghurs were involved in violence on that day, there is another side to the narrative, which involves the sometimes indiscriminate but live deadly fire on Uyghur demonstrators. And I feel that this is a point that hasn't been emphasized enough in the international media.
Thank you. When I was reading through the report, there were a number of things that struck me as very different than I'd remembered from the international press. And so the question I have for you is, when you were doing the research, what did you learn that you actually found the most difficult to believe initially? Were there reports or accusations or facts that emerged that you said, it's too outrageous, this can't be true? So what were those facts, and then how did you go about cross-checking or verifying the information to ensure that it was impartial and objective?
I guess just through some of the individual accounts that are outlined in our report, people described for instance, the torture of young Uyghurs who were arbitrarily detained, and perhaps the severity of the torture they described is really quite shocking.
When I was doing some of the interviews, I found that the reports of live deadly fire were, at first, because we haven't heard too much about this, this was something that I needed more corroboration on. And as we did more and more interviews, we found that pretty much most of the interviewees that we spoke to corroborated that particular evidence.
My next question is related, which is, what were the difficulties you experienced in actually writing the report?
I think really, first of all, being able to interview people who were actually in Urumchi in July and September was very challenging. We're obviously not able to go to East Turkestan, so we rely on people who have been able to leave the country since that time. And it's only been fairly recently that people have left, obviously. And it's also the information lockdown, the internet shut down, and the communications blockage in terms of the initial block on international phone calls. It also presented a challenge for us to get information. But I think really the biggest thing to overcome, or the biggest challenge, is the fear, the tremendous fear that people had. It took a while for people to agree to speak with us, and then even, I mean, it's obviously difficult for people to give some of these accounts of their loved ones who have been detained. I mean, one thing I might add is, you know, people are very afraid that of the effect that their accounts might have on their family members and friends who are still in East Turkestan. We've heard that Chinese authorities are harassing or persecuting the family members who remain of those people who've been able to flee, for instance, to Europe or to the United States. And so we made sure to assure people that we would not include any identifying details in the report. And it's really just, it's very difficult to work with this level of fear. One example of someone whose family members and friends were persecuted is that of the family members and friends of a man called Shokrat Hoshur, Shokrat Tursun. He was tortured to death in custody last year, and his family and friends talked to Radio Free Asia, told them about that. You know, after they received his body, they believed he'd been tortured to death in custody, and after that, Chinese authorities detained some of those people who spoke to Radio Free Asia, and they continue to detain some people in relation to that case to this day. So I think that just really illustrates the sort of legitimate fears that people have in speaking out.
I can only second Amy's comments. I think the pervasive fear was one of the largest difficulties that we faced. In the face of that, it was very, even I guess personally touching to see so many Uyghurs come forward and be brave enough and to have the courage to come speak to us and tell us their accounts. The fact is that the government of China concedes the right for Uyghurs to participate in public life, to speak out in domestic and in international obligations, but this is seldom granted to the Uyghurs, and for this reason the report allows that voice to emerge.
One of the things I found most interesting in the report was that, if I remember correctly, there were over 300 days where there was virtually no internet, cell phone, texting capacity in the entire area. So the question for you is, A, how well documented is that fact, and how did the Chinese actually go about controlling information so closely throughout that was 8 or 9 month period?
Well, I just wanted to add that in addition to the shutdown of the internet and the telephone communications that were in place, there was a definite attempt on the part of Chinese authorities to manage the information that came out of the region in other ways, such as by trying to manage the international reporting that came from the region. One example of that is when 3 reporters from Hong Kong were attempting to cover the protests of Chinese people in Urumchi in September, and those 3 Hong Kong reporters were just arbitrarily detained and beaten, and I believe they had a gun pointed at their head. And there were also other ways that the government tried to manage information. We talked with reporters who told us that everybody, all journalists in Urumchi, at least in July, who were covering the unrest, were required to be accompanied by government minders, and they were the only ones who had access to. I mean, they were given access to the only bank of computers that had internet access in the whole region, but they were the only ones, and there were only a few computers available. So it was really clearly a sort of attempt to manage the flow of information.
And I think we should restate the fact that fear exists, and not only in East Turkestan, but amongst the exiles too, that they fear for their families back home, and this also is a way of controlling information.
The report also briefly touches upon the idea that obviously the demonstrations and the crackdown and the violence last year will have long-term impacts on Han-Uyghur relations. Can you describe briefly what you think the major impacts will be from your source's point of view of the of Han-Uyghur relations in Urumchi?
What people generally told us is that the relations between Han and Uyghur were already very poor. The tensions were very high before July 5th, but now after July 5th, they've really hit an all-time low. And people were really, a lot of people spoke about the role that the Chinese government has played in that, and they really believe that the Chinese government has actively exacerbated the tensions that exist after July 5th, and rather than playing a genuine role in sort of mitigating the misunderstandings between the two sides, they're actively widening the gap.
A lot of the young Uyghurs we spoke to mentioned that there was very little future for them in East Turkestan, and even if they had bought into Chinese society, learnt Mandarin Chinese, there were very few opportunities for them, and so this was many of them said to us that they felt like they had no future.
Before we turn to our the 2 eyewitnesses for their testimony, I have a question that goes back to this the report that you guys have just finished writing obviously documents events that are quite different than were presented by the Chinese government or even covered by the international press. Do you have a sense of which of your findings or which of the facts are going to cause the most concern or raise the most questions among close observers of the situation in China? Are there startling facts in here? Are there claims that you really are prepared to have to defend?
I think the claim that indiscriminate, live and deadly fire was used against Uyghur demonstrators is one that will prove contentious. I believe that we have presented in the report enough corroborating evidence from eyewitnesses to cast sufficient doubt on the Chinese government's version of events. And for that reason, one of the recommendations we make in the report is for an independent and international investigation into the events.
I think that one story or aspect of detentions that people will really be drawn to is that of people, the website staff and journalists and bloggers who were detained after July 5th, and many of whom still remain in detention. And I just, one particular account that we relate briefly in the report is that of a young woman named Gulmira Emin, who I spoke with her husband, who's now a refugee in Norway. His name is Bakhtiar. And he spoke of how his wife, she was a poet, and then she was invited to be an administrator for a website called Salkin. And after July 5th, she was detained, and along with other people who were affiliated with that website. And she was later, she was convicted of 3 charges. I believe it was splitism, illegally organizing a demonstration, and then leaking state secrets. So those were the 3 charges. Obviously, none of those are charges of violence, but in April, Gulmira was sentenced to life in prison. And, it was really a heart-wrenching story. When I spoke with her husband, it was really difficult to talk to him about this. It's sort of hard to talk to someone whose wife has just been sentenced to life in prison for basically, writing things on a website. And also, he noted that because she was forced to, prior to her sentencing, she was forced to speak on state television, and she was compelled to make false statements about her actions and her husband's actions. And it was clear that the government was trying to make a connection with her husband because he was in Norway, because there were many attempts by officials to sort of link up these foreign hostile forces, as they called them, and sort of assert that they had some kind of a influence in orchestrating the events that occurred on July 5th. So that was the link that they made with her husband in Norway. So yeah, I mean, I hope people will really hear this story and identify with this woman and really understand the nature of the repression that the Uyghurs are experiencing.
Okay, we're now going to turn to our 2 witnesses who, as we were told earlier, are speaking remotely due to fear of reprisal for their families and other people. So we'll now hear, they'll be speaking through translation. Each of them have been asked to try to summarize and highlight some of their testimony for 5 minutes. So we'll now turn to them. The first speaker will go for 5 minutes, then the second, and after that we'll do comments before the Q&A.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, yep. Now the first witness will start.
Osh kunni 7-nji ayning 5-sida men saat 3da chonamni uyiga borgandim.
On 5th of July, I went to my grandparents' house at 3 o'clock. 3 p.m. Afternoon 3 o'clock.
Moganda piket 광장 개간데 맨 나머지 adamlar kuygandim.
When I came to People's Square in Urumchi, I saw protesters.
Lekin namoyishlarimiz o'tirib ekan, soqchilarimiz qo'ltig'ida tapancha turib, cho'risida turib ekan.
In fact, all the demonstrators were sitting. The policemen they were holding guns, and they were standing.
Lekin tushdan keyin jonimni ko'rish bo'lgan ekan, men qaytayotganda mashin yo'ldan avvalime kelib qolgandi. Ariyana orqaga.
When I came back from my grandmother's house, at the time, actually there was machine. Machine. Okay. The bus that I caught came to the back of the number 2 hospital in Urumchi.
Lekin ishlar ashu namoyishlar chiqib ketganda men qo'rqish uchun uyga ma'g'antim mashinalar yo'q. Hammasi to'xtatganda mashinalarda hammasi qo'rqinish uchun menga uyga bordim soat 9da.
In fact, at the time, all the buses, the cars, everything were kind of stopped, and everywhere was kind of very scary. So I was so scared, and I finally got go back to my home.
Soat 11da u chiroq o'chirilib ketganda maldi bilan yo'ldan keyin chiroqlarimiz o'chirib ketdi.
Soat 11 kechmi?
11 kechdi.
At 11 p.m. night time, all the lights are turned off.
Lekin men partlagan ovozni oldim, o'qning ovozini oldim.
And I heard the kind of bombing sound as well as a lot of shooting, sort of firearm sounds.
Uyg'urlarimiz qachonlar deb aytib ovozlar kelganda, ana bir qizola chaqirgan ovozni olgandim, menimcha u o'lib ketdi.
And I heard many Uyghurs telling each other that we should escape, run away. And even I heard one girl was screaming, I'm sure she's dead. I'm sorry. We were so scared we couldn't sleep until 1 a.m.
7. ayın 6'sı atganda qopsaq bizim məni aqlı bir şoplan ham batı. Adamlar yig'ilib ketdi. Ana derzim mara qarsaq shoplanlar hamsi tümürlerini kesib taqib o'tibdi.
Endi oldu. On 6th of July morning, actually, I saw there was one kind of a place where the people gather, the Chinese people gather. I saw that, the Chinese people actually giving each other or spreading, handing out steel buttons, steel sticks.
Aş küçük üzgürevatkanı kögendim. Aniki urup yatırırkende adamlar bese yığılıp ketkende hamısı urup yana kançık ketdi.
And I saw a Uyghur man was running on the street, and those Chinese were beating him. And the Uyghur man was bleeding, and the people actually kind of ran around him.
Hamısı ketkenlikken bir ayal kelip İgizpes ayağını bilen kiraya tepkenini kögendim. Jürgen izleyip. Xitay ayol.
And then after all people left, one Chinese woman came wearing high heel shoes, and I saw that woman was actually beating on his, kicking on his the face, the Uyghur wounded man's face, and I felt so hard. My heart was broken.
bir kemliken bir hükümlülükü çakayantı kilip erbile karab aşını götürüp lan maşına taşlap lan egetti.
And after a while, I saw one truck came with a military army inside it, and they just collected that wounded man, and put him in the truck and take him away.
7. ay 7'si üy çıkarmay derdi tala karab tuğan tok adamlar tağımı yığılıp ketkendi.
On 7th of July, again, we were not able to go out, and we looked through windows to outside.
Yolda emmisi okşaş tokmaklarını götürüp vağı karab adam biz derizliğimi karamıdık.
And on 7th of July, we saw that many Chinese people carrying the sticks, the same sticks, and walking on the streets screaming. And we were not able to go out again.
Çünkü aşkını tala çıkarmaya korkup biz mi uyda tereyağı kılıp eğer uy mali kirip uyla kirip kalsa can tikimizde olduk.
And on that day, we were not able to go out, and we were so scared. And we were also kind of getting ready that if they come to our house and attack us, we have to also do the self-defense, and we would attack them as well.
9. ayın 4'de ben mektep bağlantım. Mektepte sınıf bala emmisi 7. ayını 5 ilamdaydı. 7. ayın 6 ile 7'lerden işlendi deymeydi.
And on 4th of September, I went to school. But within the school, they were only talking about 5th of July, but nobody was kind of talking about 6th and 7th of July.
Mektepte bir tunga ağayla battı. O bana deydi, o hicazan turttu. O məlde sakçılar yığılıp, emmesi adamlarını tutup, o çöpünü töpsü tızılap, pidey bilen bağlap koyğantı.
And I had one Hui Dungan friend in a school, and he used to live in Hijazan. And he told me that the policemen actually arrested people, sort of tied them each other and put them on top of the grass.
Anneki adamneki çıklıqıda tötal maşın patmaş üçün adam emmesi bir-birine yatqızıp qatağısıға maşın kirgizganini kördüm deydi.
And that my Hui friend witnessed that actually the people, the sort of dead person was so many. And in fact, there was 4 truck. The 4 truck, they put all the, pilot our bodies into the trucks, and that my friend saw.
Anneki o mələmdə oxunu işkital oxunu tip bağantı tam tarafta kan batı da baştan köydüm hakkı bilmediğenti ama oldu.
And in that street, I found 2 bullets, and people told me that never ever tell anyone that I found 2 bullets.
9. ayda okul sancısını gelip çıkantı, kokap tala çıkamantı, acemde bir nezir batı. Acaba bağımlısı bulmayızken tok kızlar bilen görüşmen de şunğananlı bağlantı pikat maşın saklavatkan.
9. ayda dedim.
9. ay 7'si.
On 7th of September, my sister, she wanted to go in
Şunğananlı pikat 7. yolundan pikat.
My sister went to the bus stop at Xinhuananlu in Urumchi.
Anneki acamını bir Xitay ayol okul sebetkenine haberini anlagan top.
And we heard that one Chinese woman actually put the needle at the back of my sister. We move on to second witness. Sorry, he's unable to speak anymore.
Understand. So we'll now hear from the second witness.
The second witness, yes.
Thank you.
Biz boş vaxtda 6 cenazə qaldı bolğan bu aylıqlar ölkət kəndləşir. Xalq meydançı
I actually took part of the demonstration which held on 5th of July because we came to the People's Square with other people whose relatives are dead in the Shaoguan incident in inner China. And the demonstration was quite peaceful. All people want to do on that day is just to came to the People's Square and demand justice or just ask answer from the government about what has happened in Shaoguan. However, on the demonstration or protest day, in fact, the police came after just the 5-10 minutes all day, and then you can hear that the bullet sound, the firing arm sound, the bomb sound, all the way until, and also they turned off all the lights at 11 p.m. at night on 5th of July. And also because I live in Uyghur residential area of the Urumchi, like more Uyghur populated area, so all night I heard that people are screaming. Not much thing happened on 6th of July in the street where I live. However, on 7th of July, many Chinese people took to the streets for demonstration. Actually, many Chinese people, even hotels, restaurants around them all supported. Even government kind of gave them water to drink and also handed out all the standard sort of stakes for them. And also on the days on TV, both Li Zhi as well as Wang Lichuan, the leader of the Xinjiang province, and they keep kind of said to the people that we stand by you and we stand with you to fight with the terrorists. On 7th of July, I saw that the Chinese mobs was attacking on Uyghurs on the streets, and that they were kind of walking towards the building where I live. And I saw actually Chinese army and the police military were kind of protecting them. And even they just clapping the hand, showing that they're quite happy that while the other Chinese mobs were attacking on Uyghurs. Actually, all the way on 7th of July, when Chinese people took to the streets for demonstration, the Chinese police and the army were kind of protecting them side by side. And they were kind of screaming and shouting the slogans that we killed the Uyghurs. Hi, Brian. The witness are finished. That's that much they could say. Hello.
Thank you very much. I think I speak on behalf of all of us that it was just phenomenal to have these two witnesses testimony about the events in Urumchi last year, and that their courage is simply inspiring. With that, let me now turn to our two commentators. The first one is Sophie Richardson, who is the Advocacy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division and oversees the organization's work on China. Her book on Chinese foreign policy is forthcoming from Columbia University Press, titled?
Oh my God, I can't remember the title of my.
Any event, you can Google Sophie's name, and it will be a great read, I'm sure. You should know the title of your own book, Sophie. Her book on Chinese foreign policy is forthcoming, and she is also published on domestic Chinese political reform, democratization, and human rights in Cambodia, China, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. A graduate of the University of Virginia and Oberlin College, Dr. Richardson speaks Mandarin Chinese. Clothilde has been working for Reporters Without Borders in Paris since 2007. She is now the Washington director of the organization, helping to promote press freedom and free speech around the world. In Paris, she was in charge of the Internet Freedom Desk and worked on China, Iran, Egypt, and Thailand. During the time she spent in Paris, she was also updating the Handbook for Bloggers and Cyber Dissidents, which was published in 2005. Sophie?
Thanks. Obviously, I'm a little bit distracted. I think the appropriate place to start is to thank very much the witnesses on the phone for having the faith and the confidence to share all of that with a group of people they can't even see. Thank you very much for arranging that and for having this event. Last but not least, congratulations to the UHRP on getting a report out. I know how hard these things can be. I just wanted to make two quick points that I think pick up on some of Henry and Amy's answers to Brian's questions earlier. The first of which is about information and the power of it and who controls it. In the aftermath of the protests last year, my organization, Human Rights Watch, wrote mostly about the problem of enforced disappearances, which in the human rights world rank among the most serious kinds of abuses that a state can perpetrate, largely because it does involve state actors carrying out violations of their own laws. All countries have laws that allow security forces to detain, to investigate, to arrest, to prosecute people who have committed laws. The idea that a state can detain, prosecute, and refuse to even acknowledge that it holds people is wholly illegal, both under international law and under Chinese law. That we were able to document several dozen of these kinds of cases in the matter of a couple of days, I think is indicative of just how serious the problems are. And I think the larger problem of enforced disappearances speaks very much to one of the key points of the report, which is that, you know, for a state to simply deny that it has done these things, for a state to radically rewrite history, for a state to invest so much energy and so many resources into constructing a very particular narrative and try to impose it as the one and only story of what happened is, I think, deeply alarming. And in that sense, I think any information that people have, any stories people can share, any facts, any maps, anything is incredibly important, not just for knowing what happened in those couple of days, but for challenging the Chinese government's proclivity for this kind of essentially revisionism. The other quick point that I wanted to make was about the role or the handling or the treatment of the international press in the days immediately following the protests. It's true that to some extent that coverage may have left something to be desired. You know, it was not what we would all expect if you saw, excuse me, comparable events in Los Angeles or Paris. At the same time, it was, I think to us at least, significantly different from what had happened in Tibet, a few months earlier, where journalists were simply, especially foreign correspondents, were literally not allowed into the region at all. There was a very systematic effort to keep them out of the TAR formally and Tibetan areas. Urumchi, at least, was a little bit different, and I'll say in a minute why I think it wasn't better, but it was different in that having learned the wrong lesson from the Tibet experience, I think the Chinese government moved very quickly actually to facilitate getting foreign correspondents at least to Urumchi. They didn't do it in Kashgar, they didn't do it in other cities. They set up a press center. There were daily press briefings. You know, you would have thought that in some ways this was sort of a normal government response to a crisis with, you know, in the sense that they were going to respond to legitimate demands for information. I think the quality of information that was offered up at those briefings was, it was extraordinary if you think about some of the journalists, some of whom were very seasoned journalists who had spent a lot of time in China. The idea that the Chinese government would facilitate handing such incredible crap propaganda to those kinds of correspondents in those circumstances, I think actually reinforced precisely the opposite effect, at least of what the Chinese government had intended. And then we saw fairly shortly thereafter the predictable responses of sending correspondents back, of keeping them from speaking with people, of punishing them for trying to sort of stray from organized tours, that kind of thing. And I think it's very telling that some of the journalists who've just finished on the latest government-orchestrated tour to Tibet have come away, I think, with still more negative views of how the Chinese government tries to handle the international press at a time when, in theory, the comfort level should be going up, not down. And I think that's also a fairly negative sign. I'm going to hand over to Clothilde.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you also for this report, and thank you to the witnesses. It's actually hard to comment when you hear such things, and so the work you did is amazing. Thanks. Actually, when July 5th, I was coming to the office in Paris in charge of my Internet Freedom Desk. And so I come to the office, and my assistant is coming to me saying, "It's shut down." So the reflex you have at Reporters Without Borders when you say it's shut down, you know it's China. So, okay. My question was, is that Tibet? No. So we put a lot of research, and actually it was also holidays, so we had very small means to do that. But I asked maybe 4 people to work on that question and to try to get the information. Because when what we witnessed was from outside, so from Paris, was that you had 50 forums, online forums, shut down on the first day. And the Chinese government put, restrictions and on expressions online. Among them were the words Xinjiang, blood, hands, Uyghurs, Rabia Kadir, and all those American association defending the rights of Uyghurs. And so we saw that, and we released all that. But that was before the complete shutdown of it. So we had that information. And we were surprised to see that actually reporters were going there. We were just amazed to see that. So they are going there. Okay, now what will they report about? And they put out numbers, and you were right. Yeah, the Chinese government gave numbers. What we did is when they came back to Paris for the French correspondent. When they came back, we asked them, what did you think about the situation there? And some reporters were telling us, basically, they just allowed us to be there from an international point of view, to show you that we were able to go there. I'm not happy with the work I did there. And they also told us, as Reporters Without Borders, it must be very hard for you to criticize only on the internet side, but not to be able to criticize the fact that the information is crap, because if you do that, you're criticizing the work of your colleagues and not the Chinese government attitude, because you are just qualifying the information your colleagues are given to the world. So it was a very difficult thing for us to do. And so the point on the international press is that, yes, it was biased, and most of them acknowledge that. And you have interviews on journalists who are not happy about what they did there. The Chinese government was also with the media. It was so they allowed those foreign correspondents and the local journalists to be there, and they were broadcasting that live demonstration from Hands Against Uyghurs. Very proudly, they showed 12 journalists be there and allowed to broadcast it. So what it was simply a real strong message. From the internet point of view, it was just you shut down the country. It is what happened in Tibet. It is what happened in Burma. It's a political gesture. When you shut down your region or your country from the internet, is you show the world it's not your problem, and we don't want to tell you what is happening. When you allow reporters there and you give them propaganda, it's exactly the same will, but it shows another fact of how you want to handle the information. And so showing that you had those reporters there was also showing that, you see, we can do it. And we can even do it ironically, because you know it's not a good job. I'll stop there. If there is any question, I'll be happy to take them.
Good. Thank you. We now have about 15 or 20 minutes for a Q&A. I would encourage you, if you have a question, to please keep it brief and focused. If you have a particular speaker that you would like to direct it at, please note that at the beginning. I believe the two witnesses are still with us, so if you have a question for the witnesses, please try to make it very clear so that they can have it translated and respond appropriately. But let me first give each of the panelists on the podium with me an opportunity to offer any other comments they might have on what was said by either the two witnesses or the two commentators. Do you want to start, Sophie?
Yeah. Just another, I wanted to take a stab at answering one of the questions that Brian put to you guys earlier about the larger consequences for Han-Uyghur relations. One of the dimensions of the Chinese government's response, both to problems in Tibet and problems in Xinjiang, that, you know, the denial of the underlying problems that I've always found, just on a very pragmatic level, baffling, is that continuing to cast the problems in those regions as somehow being a function, or exclusively a function of ethnicity, strikes me in the long run as being unwise, because to treat them as such, all it does is really further tension, that at some point you've either got to deal with it or further repress it, right? And this is not a recipe for success for what the Chinese government claims it wants. And I mean, I assume the reason for casting these problems this way, I think this is very true in Tibet as well, is that if one were to sit down and think about, for example, you know, some of the serious socioeconomic concerns in Xinjiang or in Tibet, you would actually see significant overlap with lots of other people in China too. And that to discuss those problems in that way as ones that affect lots of different kinds of people that are not necessarily ethnic issues is really not in the Chinese government's interest. And so it seems very, I understand the political logic of it, but in the long run it strikes me as being a very counterproductive strategy.
Okay, the floor is now open for questions. In the front here. Wait for the mic, please, so the witnesses can hear.
Hi, I'm Drew Gladney, and just a question about the press reporting. I think Clothilde made a very nice comment that even though journalists have been given very open access recently to Tibet, nevertheless the reporting is coming out very critical. I was surprised that the journalists that were invited to Urumchi actually were able to make calls to people like me, routed through a phone exchange service in Beijing and then on to New York and DC offices. And that they did seem to, even though they were shuttered within Urumchi from really finding out what's going on, they seem to be incredibly informed through making those calls. And therefore, I never did find any single reporting from any of those journalists that was positive at all. And I'm wondering if anyone else can disagree with that. So inviting them in was incredibly counterproductive.
Everyone, I think, agrees with you, no? Point well made. Do we have other questions? Yes, in the back here.
Hello, my question is...
Can you identify yourself, please?
I'm from Reporters Without Borders. To what extent could we be witnessing the beginning of a genocide?
Tough question. I think that we just don't have enough information, and what we heard from the witnesses and the emotional distress only highlights the fear and the lack of information that is coming out. What I would like to see is the Chinese government take a real introspective look at its policies, and then perhaps we can start to mitigate the grievances and the environment in which the Uyghurs find themselves in East Turkestan.
I'd say that a lot of Uyghurs we talked to for this report, or that we've talked to in general, believe that there's what they call a cultural genocide going on. There's just such a severe repression of even the expression of their identity, their cultural practices, or their religious beliefs, which are really central to their identity. The government just gives them no forum to express their identity, even online, particularly after July 5th. And I really got the sense from young Uyghurs that we talked to for this report that people really want to, as much as they love East Turkestan and they love their culture, they really want to get out. They want to go to other countries. That was a really almost everyone simply wanted to leave the country so they could seek a future somewhere else. People spoke to us a lot about knowing Mandarin Chinese, but not feeling that they would have any opportunity to advance, even if they were fluent in Chinese.
Hello, Brian. Can I talk?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Look, for the question of, do you think this is a kind of genocide, the beginning of the genocide? And the witness kind of wish to give comment on this question.
Okay, feel free.
One of the witnesses saying that, yes, we do see in that way, because right now what is happening in East Turkestan is the Chinese authorities, or they kind of start to attack on the young people. Many people are the older people, helpless children, and the young ones they can't help themselves. They are just there. The only people who can kind of keeping life alive is sort of young people, but now in many ways we are under attack, so that's why we are sort of fleeing. Yes, we can say that sort of genocide is beginning.
Aşu yaş balla bolsalam aşu tutup akitip bana bolsalam bize bana bolsalam tutuldu bazen çağda bana yok mu işte sen bağmağanlarmı окшап калдыган ошо шошондо чыкпаганлар болсун окшап калсалар ошо tutуп кетүү маалыматны tutпесине ошо 3 бар болгон үчүн ошо активге биздин маалды ишке балны экет көт.
Like for example, currently the Chinese government is arresting sort of any young people. You know, they try to find an excuse to arrest, but if they don't find any excuse, they just arrest you first, and then start to find excuse for you to excuse to punish you. Like simply from my street, they have arrested 4 young people. And even sometimes any one of the Han Chinese has sort of don't like Uyghurs or young people, or they have sort of revenge mind, and then they just tell the authority that, and then the authority would arrest them for them. We have witnessed many times that, like, for example, if young Uyghurs walking on the streets, if they've been attacked by the Chinese and they just beat them down, and then nobody would ask, and then nobody would question those Chinese who attacked on Uyghurs. But if Uyghurs does just a little one thing, and it's the straight for Uyghurs, is the place they go is prison. Okay, Brian?
Yes, they're finished. Thank you. Okay, I think we had another question in the middle here.
Hi, I'm Ruby Hong. I'm an intern at Hudson Institute. So I'm just really interested in one of the comments that Ms. Amy Reger made, saying that the Chinese government actively exacerbated the tension between the Han and Uyghur relationship. So what did the government actually do, or why did they do that?
Thank you. I'm not sure if I can answer why they did it, but for one thing that we heard from people we talked to was that during the September unrest, the government really heavily reported on the alleged spate of needle stabbings that was taking place around the city, and they really placed the focus on Uyghurs as the attackers, and every day officials like Reger, the mayor, he's the mayor, right, or the party chief of Urumchi, he would talk about how Uyghurs were attacking Chinese people with needles, and this was a premeditated terrorist attack. And at the same time, we know that these beatings of Uyghurs were taking place in the city during the time, and there was no reporting of this at all in the official press. In contrast to the way in which in July the government widely reported on Uyghur violence against Chinese residents of Urumchi.
I think that's a key point for this question, is the differing Chinese government reactions to the unrest in September and in July. And I think that Reger also in July was also responsible for some irresponsible remarks. I believe it was on the 6th of July when Chinese were on the streets looking for Uyghurs in reprisal attacks.
Good. Do we have any other questions? In the front here, Louisa.
Louisa Grieve, I'll just take advantage of the moment to say I talked to some young Uyghurs who were students outside of East Turkestan, and they happened to go home in July, and then they were back out when I spoke to them last fall. And they said the most amazing thing that they couldn't believe the Chinese government was doing when they were in Urumchi and in another city. The television, multiple times through the day, throughout the month of July, and certainly the radio, played the loops over and over again showing terrible scenes of Uyghurs beating. And they said, why would you show it day after day? No government controlled, no broadcaster, and no broadcaster controlled by a government would show scenes of brutality, showing ethnic hatred, showing violence of one person against another, unless it had to know that this would cause terrible feelings of anger and revulsion on the part of certainly everybody watching, but certainly Han Chinese looking, and that should, especially the more they're exposed to it, the more they would fear Uyghurs. And so I think it's incontrovertible that there was a deliberate policy day after day of trying to, of allowing Han residents watching any kind of media when they're living in East Turkestan to see that it's good to hate the Uyghurs.
Okay, we have one question back here. Let's take these last two questions. So we'll take them together as we have time for both.
Hi, my name is Alfidar. I'm just a member of Uyghur American Association. I just wanted to give an example. My fiance's brother was also a web editor for thearmy.com, and he was taken by Chinese police in August. And since then, we've never heard of him. We don't even know if he's alive, he's been tortured, nothing. My fiance was brave enough to talk about it until last month, and he received a phone call from his parents, crying and begging. They were interrogated and harassed by Chinese police, then said, if we speak up, he will never see his brother. So this is just one example. My question is, I know this is not the end. July 5th is not the end. This is going to happen again, and Chinese government is going to continue to do things like this. What are you guys planning to do in the future? Because they're basically like stopping people to talk about it, fearing them. And what are you guys going to do in the future to reach the truth?
Thank you. Let's take the second question right now, also right here.
My name is Sarah. I'm also an intern at the Hudson Institute, and my question is also having to do with more like foreign policy. And to what extent does the Chinese government exploit the fact that the Uyghurs are Muslim and sort of use that, to sort of exploit the fact that they might be terrorists and use that, especially in dealing with the United States and saying like a lot of this has to do with our fight with the war on terror, and how does that impede, how does that, stop the international community from addressing the situation simply because they're exploiting this fact?
Good. Okay. Let's just start and go around the panelists. And also, if either of the two witnesses want to jump in, feel free. Why don't we go through the four panelists, and then you guys, if the two witnesses want to say something, we'll let you go at the very end.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'll let them know.
Thanks for your questions. If I could just address the question of the foreign policy and the Uyghurs as Muslims. Since September 11th, right after September 11th, there was a clear shift in strategy on the part of the Chinese government to highlight the Muslim beliefs of Uyghurs, but to misconstrue this as having something to do with terrorism. And what I'm particularly suspicious of this news that was released just a couple of days ago by the Chinese state media, that they've just uncovered a major terrorist ring in East Turkestan, and they've specifically charged two individuals as sort of ringleaders who allegedly sort of sent emails to their associates as they were traveling through different parts of China. And then the state media also showed all these pictures of sort of very basic weaponry that were allegedly belonged to this terrorist ring. And while I can't say this is not true, the way in which these allegations were presented without any evidence, without any clear evidence and not in a transparent manner is really consistent with the way in which China has levied these terrorist allegations against Uyghurs since 2001, and the terrorist connection has definitely been used to further the Chinese government's or to justify the Chinese government's repression, its repressive tactics against the Uyghurs.
Just to add briefly, and I think it's an attempt to garner sympathy in the international community for its repression in East Turkestan. So it's absolutely true to say that the Uyghur belief in Islam is certainly used against them in furthering China's repression within the region. In terms of what are we going to do next, Amy and I, we have a wealth of material. We believe at this point that we haven't even been able to fit it all in this particular report. And I believe that we will be continuing to work on July 5th and what happened in September too, and produce further work. For me, and I guess I keep repeating this point, the reason that this work is important, and it's important to us, is that it actually gives a forum for Uyghurs. We strongly believe that Uyghurs have the right to participate in their social, cultural, economic, and political life, but this is something that is just not a possibility in the region today.
Thank you. I'll take what do we do next? I totally agree with you. It's Uyghurs should have the right to speak, to free speech, and to express themselves. And first of all, we have the duty to put pressure on the governments to make it happen. So what we do at Reporters Without Borders, and what we have always done, is helping the reporters who are going there, defending their rights, and helping to get credentials, passes, to put down all those barriers, and then they can access to that information and try to do the report and make it happen daily or weekly, but not once, and then remember 1 year after, 2 years after. It's better than nothing, but it has to be, we have to recall that and to know what is going on a daily basis. It's something that we are trying to do, thanks to the context that we have in China. I'd love to go there. I'm not allowed by the government to go to China. And most of Reporters Without Borders staff is in the same situation. So definitely helping the reporters get the message out and put pressure on the government.
Thank you for sharing that story with us. Look, it's a bit difficult to see any bright spots when you're dealing with a government that only has that only musters two responses to problems, one of which is trying to co-opt the problem, and the other is trying to crush it. That's a difficult script to deal with. I think the kinds of actions that we have taken and continue to take are urging, as these guys have done, a credible international investigation, the involvement of the relevant UN special rapporteurs. There are other, I think, sympathetic Muslim communities that have expressed concern about what's happened in Xinjiang. We heard some voices last year out of Turkey, out of Indonesia. I think to the extent that those can be put forward to the Chinese government separate from the US government or the EU, that's incredibly helpful. The Chinese government needs to hear this message from as many different parts of the world and as many different communities as possible. On the question about the war on terror, it is, I think, indisputably true that the Chinese government exploited the heck out of that opportunity. And so in terms of really near-term steps we would like to see, I would very much like to see the Obama administration undo a Bush administration mistake of acknowledging the existence of ETIM and take it off the list. But I'd also really like to see the Obama administration take a page from the Bush administration's playbook and have a meeting with Mrs. Kadir.
Thank you very much. Let me first thank our two witnesses. I think it goes without saying that it's without people like you who have the courage to speak up, we never know the truth about these very, very difficult and dangerous situations. It is extremely inspiring to me personally to hear the stories, and without your voices and your courage, we simply do not know what happens in these situations, and I just would applaud you for taking this very brave step. To the Uyghur Human Rights Project, if you want to read the report, which I encourage all of you to do, it's at www.uhrp.org. You can also read Sophie's book, as I said earlier, but please join me in thanking the four speakers and the two witnesses for their extremely moving testimony.